An attribute error is the other result when we try to do something in our code that just kind of doesn't make sense. The difference between type errors and attribute errors can be a little technical, so don't worry about which one you're encountering for now. Instead, just understand that they're two errors that correspond to times when we do things that don't really make sense. So here we have code that creates two variables. Again, don't worry too much about what variables are quite yet. We're talking about these errors now so that when we talk about variables next, you know how to recover from the errors that you might encounter. So we're creating two variables, A and B. To A, we assign the value of some string of characters, here hello world, and to B, we assign an integer, 5. When this code runs, it runs line 1, creates variable A and gives it the value hello world. Then it runs line 2, creates the variable B and gives it the value 5. And then it runs line 3. Line 3 again starts with a print statement, but it puts something kind of funny looking inside the body of the print statement. A dot ends with quotation D. Try real quick to guess what this might mean. Well, we know that A had the value hello world. We don't really know what the dot means, but we can kind of infer what ends with might mean. We might guess that it's kind of like a question. Does A end with whatever's in these parentheses? In this case, these parentheses have the letter D, so we might infer that this is asking whether A ends with D. And sure enough, it does. And so when we print the result of that statement, it prints the word true. It's true that A ends with the letter D. Now don't worry if that doesn't make sense quite yet. We won't actually cover that for quite a long time. The reason we're talking about it now is just because we might see instances where we see this kind of error. When it runs line 4, it tries to ask whether B ends with D. But while A was a string of characters, B is an integer. Just like it made sense to ask the length of a string of characters, it also kind of makes sense to ask whether a certain string of characters ends with a certain letter. Just like it didn't make sense to ask for the length of an integer, it also doesn't really make sense to ask if an integer ends with a certain letter. And so that's what happens here. Python tells us that in our attribute error file, on line 4, on the line print b.ends with d, we get an attribute error. The explanation of the attribute error is that int has no attribute ends with. That's very similar to the explanation we saw before. When we asked for the length of an integer, the computer responded by saying that integer had no length. Here it says integer has no attribute ends with. So really, these are conceptually the same kind of error. The difference between them is more technical. We'll talk about the difference when we get to data structures in Unit 4.